Though it's very much a different story today, there was a time when BioWare could do no wrong. The studio, like many people, was responsible for introducing me to role-playing games, and my love of them ever since, as for over a decade, they put out classic after classic, Mass Effect 2, Dragon Age Origins, Knights of the Old Republic, the criminally underrated Jade Empire, or Neverwinter Nights, and the community campaigns in its wake. This run of games was nothing short of legendary, almost single-handedly defining Western RPGs, and inspiring countless developers who would try and follow in their wake, some of them emulating them a little too closely. None of this would have been possible, however, without the landmark that is Baldur's Gate. Even ignoring the impact of the Infinity engine in general, Baldur's Gate 1 and 2 are undoubtedly, along with Fallout 1, the most important RPGs ever made, if not the greatest as well. While it wasn't until later that I'd check out their older titles, Baldur's Gate 2 in particular is absolutely phenomenal, and even to this day the standard to which all other RPGs are compared. But times change, developers come and go, spin-offs, prequels, sequels, and spiritual successors all try their hand at recapturing that lightning in a bottle, and yet, for 20 years, nothing could even come close to the absolutely momentous achievement and pinnacle of CRPGs that BioWare had left in their wake. Enter Larian Studios. Hot off their success with Divinity Original Sin 2, the latest in a series that had struggled to find its way into the breakout success of Kickstarter in the 2010s, they had proven to not only themselves, both critically and financially, but Wizards of the Coast that they could have the keys to the throne. A follow-up to not just any licensed title, but the CRPG. After roughly 6 years of development and 3 in early access, here it is. What a disappointment. Considering the overwhelming acclaim it's received, maybe it sounds like I'm just being a contrarian, or bitter as if trying to relive the glory days, whenever they supposedly were. In reality, I wanted this game to live up to everything it promised. I wanted to lose days or weeks of my life to scouring the world, dozens of playthroughs, agonizing over build variety and seeing every choice outcome. But that is not the kind of game Baldur's Gate 3 is. And that truly is a shame. That being said, it's still a good, well-made game. Hell, it's even great. I'm genuinely happy for Larian and hope that they continue to go from strength to strength. Despite some missteps, they're a developer that has sadly become all too rare in how they approach anything they work on. I want them to continue at their best, even if Baldur's Gate 3 isn't for me. For full transparency, when I used to work in game dev, I applied on multiple occasions to work for Larian, specifically for the chance to work on 3, as much as being part of one of the few genuine CRPG developers left. Although I never progressed beyond the test stage, the kind feedback I received at the time was super gratifying to a starry-eyed developer looking to do whatever he could to work on the role-playing games he adored so much. You might think that has coloured my perspective somewhat, given that a lot of what I'm about to go over is negative. That is your choice. All I can say is that I didn't expect to be hired, but nevertheless wanted Larian to smash it out of the park. Give us a game that meets, or even exceeds, the Bolspawn saga. But this is not it, and I need to get my thoughts out somewhere about why exactly that is. To put it simply, Baldur's Gate 3 not only fails to live up to its predecessors, but actively damages their legacy and well-established canon. Not only that, it misses the mark when judged as a role-playing game in its own right, repeating the same mistakes of Original Sin which feel even worse here. That's a lot to take in, I know, but after waiting 3 years for the release, it's just as difficult for me to say. It spent so long in early access, in fact, that I actually forgot about it until getting a notification from Steam on the day of release. At that point, there were no expectations. I just wanted to go in with an open mind and appreciate it for what it was. Unfortunately, there are too many, often fundamental issues that outweigh all this game does get right. But that is just my opinion. If you're just looking for more Divinity, or a fun, densely packed game to play, especially in co-op, look no further. Same goes for playing 5th edition without all the paperwork. This is not an attack on you or the entertainment you enjoy, but constructive criticism that I hope someone finds some value in. Baldur's Gate 3 may have the number, the budget, the dice roll, the city, and the choices, but a true perfect sequel this is not. Now, in no particular order, let's talk about why. I don't think I've ever played a game where my opinion has swung so wildly, even up to the very end of a 70+ hour playthrough. I was really not enjoying Baldur's Gate 3 within the first hour or so, to the point that I came very close to refunding it. I don't regret my purchase, and I'm glad I saw the game through, but that's come with a few caveats. For as beautiful as the world is, and make no mistake, I'm not trying to diminish how much work the art team has put into this, I can't help but feel like something has been lost in focusing on being cinematic. As soon as starting a new game, we're hit with a pre-rendered sequence establishing the Nautiloid, Githyanki, and our dip into the Hells. Back when Baldur's Gate 3 was first announced, it was one of the first things they showed off, and while, sure, it looks nice, and no doubt was very expensive to make, it's also jarring. Contrast this with the opening of Original Sin 2, which was brief and to the point, establishing Source and the Voidwoken for those who hadn't played the first game, or Dragon Age Origins and how it masterfully set up its new world and central conflict in the space of a few minutes. Baldur's Gate 3 doesn't need to do this, of course. Even people who have never heard of the Forgotten Realms before would have enough understanding of fantasy tropes and D&D from its influence on pop culture to get the gist. But lacking the simple elegance of flavor text and maintaining the isometric viewpoint of previous titles, Larian wanted to have it both ways. The motion capture work undoubtedly adds a lot of nuance to scenes, which is crucial at some of its best moments, but at the same time, there's a certain level of awkwardness and jank. Visualizing the dice rolls on screen is a nice touch, but as a lot of what you'll be seeing is not mocapped, but a pool of general animations, the goofiness of standing on the spot while the narration tries to convey in a more traditional style what the cutscene can't, often just ends up feeling kinda goofy. It reminds me of Dragon Age Origins actually, where the occasional cut to the Warden's wild expressions felt equally as off, since they were also a silent protagonist that very rarely took center stage in cutscenes. Couple this with the fact that actual dialogue prompts still feel like a placeholder for proper UI, just white text at the bottom of the screen. It doesn't come together as often as it should. Larian should be applauded for punching well above their weight, and there are some magnificent moments for sure, such as the confrontation with Shah, meeting Aelin in the Shadowfell, or, yes, even how well composed and mature the romance scenes were handled. The lighting is almost always stunning, and although the long load times remain an issue due to how Larian handles world spaces, this is a game that looks among the industry's best. It also cannot be overstated just how impressive it is that the entire game is fully voiced. But at the end of the day, these are secondary, as nice as they are. And unfortunately, there are a lot more fundamental issues to come. One of the most disappointing aspects of Baldur's Gate 3 is in just how much Larian has failed to improve upon the issues from Original Sin, specifically choice, the tangible effects from said choices, and how little you actually matter. Don't matter, you say? But we're the protagonist, right? We're the Scourge of the Voidwoken, the Divine Ascendants, the keepers of that Pandora's box thing from Original Sin 1, or true souls whose free will remains their own, for the most part anyway. These titles would be all fine and well on their own, but as a follow-up to two wonderful games where who your character was and the role you played in events was not only pivotal but actively shaped the world, the tag system that Larian uses is nowhere near good enough. Part of this touches on the age-old pre-established or blank slate character debate that's been going on in role-playing games for time immemorial. From the get-go, the narration makes it clear on waking aboard the Nautiloid that the tadpole has messed with your memories, and that whoever you were before and how you came to be here, beyond playing as an origin character, is completely irrelevant. That's fine, a perfectly valid route to take, much like an Elder Scrolls or, usually, Fallout protagonist, because from there your character is then defined by the actions they take, would that the path, the obstacles they overcome along it, and choices that shape it amount to anything significant. But first, we need to talk about the story. I'll be honest, I wasn't really sure how to feel when the game was first announced, and it seemed like the main quest was centered around Illithids. If you played the original games, you might remember that they were just kinda there, in the background, with a colony to stumble on beneath Athkatla. Same with the couple of Gith who appeared in Ust-Natha. But now they're raging on the surface for some reason, and while I'm sure there's some kind of adventure path or wider canon to explain the reason for dropping into Baldur's Gate in broad daylight, the premise of being infected by mind flayers and trying to find a cure just feels kind of random. Maybe it's just me, but beyond the personal goal of, not wanting to die, there doesn't feel like much to care about or reason to get invested. And sure, what about being a mailman in New Vegas, or getting sent out to find a water chip, or wielding the power of pointless exposition dumps in Pillars of Eternity? But for a game that hinges around a much larger, grander conflict between the Githyanki, Dead 3, and Elder Brain, can there not be a little more effort put into getting players invested than just happenstance? This barely scratches the surface of how underwhelming the main story of Baldur's Gate 3 is, because the premise is where the problems only begin. But first, here's a question for you. What even is the central theme? In Dragon Age Origins, it's sacrifice. In Baldur's Gate 2, it's the allure of power. In Original Sin 2, it's faith and struggling against the literal manifestation of nihilism. In Red Dead Redemption, it's the slow death of the Old West, swallowed by industry. In Hellblade, it's about acceptance and letting go. In Signalis, it's fatalism and trying to find meaning in an uncaring world. All the games I've just cited have clear central themes, where everything that extends from there then hinges upon. But if we come back to the original question, what is the central theme of Baldur's Gate 3? Because the campaign is so confused about what it wants to be, that it adopts and discards concepts and antagonists so abruptly, it never comes together to serve the whole. But why can't it just be a fun, entertaining fantasy story? If that's all you're looking for, that's perfectly fine, but again, I can't help having been left wanting something a little more. In summary, you are infected by a parasite that threatens to turn you into a mind flayer, then falling in with a group of strange companions who all have destinies that conveniently lead to Baldur's Gate. A cult serving an entity known as the Absolute is busy tearing up the place. Who they are and what they want is unclear, but before you reach the city, it turns out that these three people who are suddenly introduced are actually using the Absolute as a way to take power for themselves as servants of Baal, Bane, and Merkel. And the Absolute is actually an Elder Brain that turns out to be playing the long game as well, and that cube you're carrying around actually has a pocket plane with the lost heretical son of what is essentially the Githyanki's goddess inside it, which a mind flayer is using to keep you alive somehow. But now you need magic stones as well to stop and maybe bind to the Elder Brain, because the cult now may or may not be under the Three's control, and they're marching on the city, but the city is fine when you arrive, even though the brain is just chilling beneath it. If that sounds messy and incoherent, well, that's because it is. Did I miss something? Was there another entire act of the game? We'll go over this a bit more later, particularly the role of previous games, but as much as I wanted to love this game, Larian has missed the mark big time. I can't help but feel like the overwhelming praise 3 has received is because either people haven't made it far enough into the game yet to see things start to come together, or they just don't care. That rough plot outline is also unchanging regardless of what you do, and that especially hurts because of how much the game tries to make out the factions you side with will have lasting impact, when they really don't. And just wait till we get to the Emperor. For reference, by the time my vaguely neutral drow monk reached the creche in the mountain pass near the end of Act 1, I chose to ignore Vlaakith, someone who, from my character's perspective, had just popped up out of nowhere and started making demands, and support Voss in revealing the grand treachery. At this point, I was still unsure of what to make of the so-called Guardian inside the cube, but still agreed to help after confronting them inside it. I continued to, even after the reveal he was a mind flayer in disguise all along, and later, a particularly awful plot twist, but ultimately chose to refuse him before the final battle, embracing Ceramorphosis to take on the Netherstones myself, bring Orpheus to help in the process, and ultimately destroy the brain. On paper, these sound like meaty, lasting decisions to really make you think about which path to take, but that's just the thing. It's mostly smoke and mirrors. To begin with, whether or not you choose to support Vlaakith or Voss doesn't really matter until the choice with the Emperor and Orpheus before the end of the game. There were maybe 2 or 3 attacks from Gith still loyal to Vlaakith, but beyond that one camp attack where it's teased Orpheus may get free, or Vlaakith making lae'zel another offer, it felt completely pointless. Orpheus himself is yet another great example of talking up a character without the mechanical power to match. There was a real struggle to keep him alive through the last stretch of the game where he barely did any damage and was incapacitated constantly. And this is the renegade son of Gith, the all-powerful savior of his people, the prince of the comet? Then there's the Emperor. If you don't hand him the Netherstones, his character immediately does a 180, undermining everything he supposedly stood for. He then pieces out to go and join the Elder Brain, where, after flying in on a red dragon, I killed him in 2 turns with 0 ceremony. That's it. He's gone. Gathering allies is probably the most egregious just because of how much of the game is spent for this exact purpose. For those who side with Gortash or Orin later in the game, the Elder Brain just kills them anyway. There's literally no impact, beyond missing out on the otherwise decent boss fights for the same effect. The boons or summons that you spent hours going to the effort of earning are pathetic, completely invalidating these epic quests of freeing the Night Song, or that amazing sequence of rescuing prisoners from the underwater prison, or stealing the hammer from Raphael. Aelin showed up with half health and could barely hit anything. Astarion didn't seem any different to what he was before, giving me the same handful of lines. I didn't even need harpers, or guards, or tieflings for fodder when my Mind Flayer monk was busy punching or using Black Hole to turn everyone into paste. They would just get in the way. None of it matters. It beggars belief. Of course, then we get to the actual ending where things really fall apart. Larian could be forgiven for ending Original Sin 2 with fundamental world changes to the setting open, but to repeat the same again here with no explanation makes all the lead up to it a waste of time. No one reacted when I turned into an illithid, or when the Emperor decided to go and join the Brain. My party wasn't phased at all, and beyond that one guard on walking into the rubble base with everyone else, you could be forgiven for thinking I hadn't changed at all. Collecting the Netherstones is just as bad because, what do you know, it turns out the Elder Brain planned this all along, and you freed it from the Three's control, despite the fact you have artifacts in your possession that were supposedly meant to bind it to your will, or at least provide some kind of resistance like they did in the other's possession. Now it can conveniently break free of its own accord, because fuck you, that's why. And if you try and dominate it, you fail. You actually fail. The MacGuffin you spent the entirety of Act 3 trying to assemble fails. I even got a natural 20 on this check, and the game just ignored it. I can't even begin to express how unbelievable this is. By that point, I just wanted the game to be over. When it's finally beaten, the Brain falls into the harbour and there's a brief send-off with a round of generic pats on the back. If you were wondering what would happen with Orpheus in the Geth, if you would see any indication of the choices you made along the way, he just flies off with lae'zel. So much for that. Karlach, my favourite companion and a mainstay across the game, finally reaches breaking point with the Infernal Engine, but Will agrees to accompany her back to Avernus, and that's it. Good job, and then the credits roll. There's not even ending slides, as tired and much of a cop-out as they've become. A bit of text on screen to summarise everything you fought so hard for was too much to ask. I cannot believe it. If I sound upset, well, that's because I am. It is unbelievable how poorly Larian handled the story, and to have levels capped at 12 when that's when most builds start to get good. To put that in perspective, Act 1, which was available in early access and thus had the most work put into it, goes up to around 6. Despite being a third of the game, it contains the majority of content. What the hell happened, Larian? Even ignoring Original Sin, you had the license from Wizards and 3 years of a fully priced early access title behind you. Is there supposed to be a future expansion to reach level 20? Did you run out of time or money? Where is the rest of the game? Where is anything to legitimize your take on this legendary IP? What happened to Will's father after I freed him? What did my character do after helping the city as an unbound Mind Flayer? How did the Sword Coast recover from the cult? What happened to Karlach back in the Hells? What happened between Orpheus and Vlaakith? What happened to Astarion after becoming an all-powerful ascended vampire? For those who agreed to Raphael's deal, you just get a post-credit scene where he explains what he's going to do, which you already heard when he offered it in the first place. Cut content is one thing, something all RPGs have to grapple with, but for the game to fall so hard on its face in the final stretch invalidates all the effort to reach that point. You can put as many dexterity or sleight of hand or fighter or tiefling checks in dialogue as you like, but they'll always be just as tokenistic as the tag system from Divinity. It doesn't matter what game it is. Choices don't matter if you never come to see or understand the effects of said choices. Whether it's shooting someone in the face or upending a 1,000-year dynasty is irrelevant. Otherwise, why would it be different than clicking on any other dialogue prompt? You don't matter, your choices don't matter, and then the game just ends. Wow. That was a lot, but we're not finished yet. If the poorly handled campaign was upsetting, then Baldur's Gate 3 outright spits in the face of the first two games and drags characters and lore through the dirt. First of all, let's talk about the Emperor and what an awful character he is. The Guardian premise could have gone in so many directions, perhaps reflecting the player's shifting alignment as a foil for their choices, but what we got was an illithid whose goals are unexplained until, at least in my playthrough, he decided to piss off and die. If that wasn't bad enough, there was a sequence towards the end of the game where, after taking a long rest, he was sitting shirtless in the plane and struck up a conversation about the past. This seemed harmless enough at first, but the conversation took a different turn, and he started flirting. A mind flayer, flirting with my character. No joke. This isn't some fanfiction, but a multi-million-dollar studio that's about as close to AAA as it gets. If his reveal and subsequent plans weren't bad enough, then don't worry, because it turns out he's actually Baldur, the founder of the whole city, and killed his dragon buddy as well to protect himself. Now he wants 3 magical stones that definitely don't look like they've been pulled out of some Infinity Gauntlet Marvel-esque rubbish. This reeks of a senior developer's OC being inserted into the plot without thought, much like the creative director with Ava in Borderlands 3. Contrast this with Irenicus, voiced by the legendary David Warner, and one of the best villains ever written, along with Shodan and a certain character from Persona 5. It's also worth noting that weird convenience of having one artifact, but the 4+ active party members and the rest in camp still have the same dreams despite the plane being a singular physical place. Is the Emperor supposed to be able to protect all party members, even though he only speaks to the player alone and the Guardian is unique to each one? If he is able to protect more than one person, why does he keep saying that he's drained? Sure, you could argue that it's a convenience for the sake of co-op, but that's not good enough. This is a device that multiple planes are fighting over, and, much like the Netherstones, it seems like it'll be whatever the plot wants it to be. For what it's worth, Jaheira emerges as the best of them, and considering it's been more than 20 years since Heidi Shannon has done voice work, Tracy Wiles did an excellent job. The whole cast did really. All the party members absolutely killed it, with some really raw emotional scenes in particular. Though it has been a while since I played it, Wiles sounded very close to Jaheira that I did a double take at first. While it is a shame that she's apparently ended up doing the same thing, even 100 years later, it's clear her character is wiser than when she fought with the Bolspawn. It's just unfortunate that, like Orpheus, she doesn't have the power to match. It's possible that Larian saw the many complaints when Early Access first launched that the game didn't feel like Baldur's Gate, that it was too much like Divinity, and then decided that, fine, if you people want Baldur's Gate, we'll give you Baldur's Gate. Whether this played a role in what happened with the story after Act 1, we'll probably never know, but using characters they really had no right to says a lot. They just couldn't help themselves, and oh boy does it show. While Jaheira emerged relatively unscathed, and it was even nice to travel with her again, despite sidestepping any continuity with what actually happened with the Bolspawn, others aren't as lucky. This character may wear the same face paint as before, he may have the same class, he may try and act the part, but this is not Minsk. As soon as he opened his mouth, it was already over. I actually couldn't bring myself to finish Jaheira's quest, because I wanted nothing to do with what Larian have done to Minsk. His voice is completely gone. No more Jim Cummings carrying what was, otherwise, a joke character, and there was no sign of Boo from what I saw either. While I have nothing against Matt Mercer personally, I can't stand how often he overacts. The voice is a complete mismatch, and the onus was on Larian for that casting decision. Finally, we get to what really hurts. My favourite character in the original games, reduced to a throwaway boss not even worthy of a proper fight. At the end of Shadowheart's questline, a great character who surprisingly grew on me despite her initial demeanour, it's revealed that the head of the Sharan Temple, previously shown as a masked figure in flashbacks, is none other than Viconia de Vere. As if 3 wasn't already finished disappointing anyone who's played the originals by trying to pull characters from over 100 years ago back on stage, it's particularly baffling why she would even be here to begin with. It's pure convenience, for little reason beyond trying to justify the game as a sequel. Not only does his cardboard cutout start rabbiting on about Shah with none of the personality or charm of old, her voice is also just as jarring. If you haven't played the originals, Viconia fell very much into the femme fatale archetype, due in no small part to Grey Delisle's amazing performance. As a drow cleric, she was a contradiction, forced onto the surface and kept everyone at arm's length. She was cruel, ruthless, but as she gradually opened up to the player, this revealed a deeply hurt and ultimately kind soul who didn't want to risk coming to care for others. Her romance was also very rewarding, and canonically ends with her coming to terms with who she is and having a child with the Ballspawn. While I never expected Larian to cater to my canon Baldur's Gate 2 playthrough with a male human cleric, to see such a great character reduced to little more than an obstacle with a health bar is so disappointing. Thankfully, if you thought Larian was going to stop at walking over characters as well, then don't worry, because the Ballspawn saga couldn't have been left in peace either. What relevance this needed to have with a central plot around the Githyanki and Mind Flayers set over a century later, who can say? But as soon as I saw the main menu with the transition down to the temple on launching the game for the first time, my heart sank. Saravok worked as a villain in Baldur's Gate because 1. He was an unseen figure for most of the game, not a central antagonist, and 2, because it was more what he represented, the coming of Alondo's prophecy and the bloodshed needed to fulfill it. From there, Baal's legacy took a backseat as forces looking to wield that power, real or not, began to fight each other before culminating in the struggle for the throne. Of course, who your Ballspawn was came down to your particular character and playthrough, but while the gods were present, they weren't really that important to the central plot, even for a story where they were referenced heavily. In Baldur's Gate 3, it appears that Larian brought back the Dead Three, Merkel, Baal and Bane, for little reason beyond they are A. evil, and B. want power. That's it. They just want to wield the Netherstones and apparently Elderbrain for themselves. I honestly didn't care about Thorm or his motivations or suddenly fighting a big skeleton with a scythe. Same goes for Bane. Gortash was probably the strongest of the three, which isn't saying much, but that was more on the quest that revolved around taking him down than any particular depth to his character. It's Orin and stepping into the Temple of Baal where things really went off the rails. As mentioned earlier, these three characters are introduced out of nowhere towards the end of Act 2, and then supposed to have the same impact of a central, compelling antagonist. Gortash does have some relevance to Karlach that fades quickly after his death, but it's Orin in particular that feels very underdeveloped. Her character is literally nothing more than bloodthirsty maniac written on a whiteboard, and only appears to talk about how many people she's killed and how she likes the color of blood and blah blah blah. Why did the Dead Three need to be used? Imagine what this game could have been had it tried something more in the vein of Irenicus, or Rilu Vorlesh, or Fen'Harel. The Emperor, for example, could have slowly built up trust over the whole game, only to be revealed as the face of the Elderbrain all along, and there was no free will. Or maybe his cause was legitimate, but the Elderbrain begins to slowly break him down and he turns against us. Dragon Age Origins had low gain because the Darkspawn were a faceless force of nature, but still Larian can't do villains properly. If recycling Brachus Rex at the end of Original Sin 2 wasn't bad enough, the villains shoehorned into the plot of 3 are there because power. Dead gods bad. They even have the audacity to give Orin the Slayer form, something that was unbelievably fun to use and earned over the course of 2 full games. Now this stand-in that serves little relevance beyond a boss fight can use this important plot ability whenever she wants. Never mind the fact that the Slayer form was unique to Gorian's Ward all along. But look, Baldur's Gate 3 is a true sequel. Honest. We've got all the boulders and the gates you could ever want. This has come across more negative than I intended. I really did want the best for this game. If it wasn't already clear, I like Larian, I like their games, and I want them to use this as an opportunity to improve and continue to put out rich, deep RPGs. But I just can't like it, and I've already spent a great deal of time going over why that is. The voice acting, production value, wealth of content, developer practices, the immeasurable work that must have gone into just QA, all of this should be celebrated, but Baldur's Gate 3 fails where it counts. To list some other negatives, this is probably going to piss a lot of people off, but I wish Larian's games had never been made with co-op in mind. The value it adds is immeasurable, there's no doubt about that, and I don't want to make out like I'm trying to say that playing with your friends is wrong or whatever, but the knock-on effects from the world design needing to account for another player dicking around at the other end of the map, or quests needing to remain open enough should the murder hobos roll through was, honestly, a mistake. There's a good technical reason for this as well, because the world spaces are so open and culled on the fly. The long loading screens from Original Sin remain the same as ever. Maybe that's a way to dissuade save scumming, but the game can also struggle in some areas, despite playing on Ultra with DLSS, which is usually because of particles going crazy or a ton of NPCs to handle on screen. This is more in 5th edition than anything to do with Larian, but builds are pretty disappointing too. I already mentioned the level cap of a measly 12, but the racial and trait benefits are mostly unremarkable, and while I understand the desire to avoid power gaming with the roll of 90 plus in the originals, capping starting attributes between 8 and 17 feels overly balanced, as weird as that sounds. The irony is, coming off something like Original Sin 2, where balancing was completely whack and some aspects were redundant while others were stupidly powerful, I actually kind of miss that variety now. Larian have done their best to try and keep the open class system of Original Sin, especially since a lot of the build crafting fans out there are going nuts over multi-class setups, but when compared to something like Wrath of the Righteous, on trying to start a second playthrough, it felt like my character wasn't much different, regardless of the class I chose. Despite the claims of upgrading the engine to Divinity 4.0, skipping a whole number even, the game also looks and plays way too similarly to Original Sin. From the UI, to the soundtrack, to the layout of the world, to quest design, to AI behavior, to even the character creation, it's Divinity with a D&D coat of paint. As mentioned earlier, that won't be a problem for many people, and clearly isn't. After all, both Original Sin titles are great games, but this isn't Larian's own IP anymore. It's the long-awaited sequel to one of the best games ever made. If anything, it actually damages Original Sin, because now I can't think about it without it seeming like it was all just one giant test so Larian could get the go-ahead from Wizards of the Coast. Divinity was always D&D adjacent, even back to the beginning, but when what we're ultimately left with is a decent Divinity spin-off that just happens to be set in the Forgotten Realms, I can't say it was all for the best. Lastly, I know it's not exactly fair to compare 3 to other games, but I really miss the toggle between turn-based and real-time in Wrath of the Righteous. When trudging through trash mobs can take 10 minutes or more for each encounter, it really starts to drag down the whole pacing when you could just carve through filler and focus on the rest. Same goes for boss fights. If you happen to fail and reload, now you have to do it all over again. Baldur's Gate 3 is not a bad game, but it is a disappointing one, and in a lot of ways, that feels just as bad. As I said at the beginning, I'm glad for Larian that they've received the critical and commercial success that they've worked so hard for. But even choosing to ignore how badly Baldur's Gate 3 fails to live up to its predecessors, there isn't much left over. I love role-playing games and want the best for any developer brave enough to tackle what is probably the hardest genre to realize, but the fact I had to push myself to finish this, that I can't bring myself to get past the nautiloid on trying a second playthrough, I think it speaks volumes about what this game is missing. If you love it, if it's your game of the year, then don't let this video or anything I said dissuade you of that. While I'd encourage everyone to be critical of any media they consume, I also love games that are deeply flawed, broken, and buggy. Baldur's Gate 3 is, to its credit, none of these things, but it's also not as remarkable as the overwhelming reception would have you believe. At the end of the day, if you want to have fun with friends, if you want a rich world to explore with a lovingly crafted, party-based RPG, you'll probably have a great time. I didn't. Maybe that will change with time, and I hope it will.